Guatemala is the most populous and economically prosperous country in Central America, yet is in dire need of a new and improved development plan in order for the country to be truly prosperous. There are many aspects to the idea of development and many paths countries can take in order to achieve development. Development has been the center of many academic debates, and there are several development theories that have come and gone throughout history. Today, many who work in the field of foreign aid and development are beginning to realize that pouring millions of dollars into a country will not ensure that it rises out of poverty. It has been realized that the economy's success of a country is only one indicator of development, and that all areas should be given attention. Guatemala's main problems and hindrances to development are not found in the economic sector, but yet in the social, political, and government sectors. The goal for this video is to advise the government of Guatemala on the areas of development that need improvement, how best to achieve development, and who to partner with in order to achieve that development. The video will begin with an overview of Guatemala and the main concerns, then on to an assessment of the current status of development in Guatemala. This portion will include an extensive look into the main human development indicators in Guatemala and what the government should be paying attention to the most. Then I will provide my advice on which development theories will be best to utilize in order to address the areas of concern. After that, I'll provide the government with two international development actors who I believe will be able to best support the national government's pursuit of development. One is a governmental agency and one is a non-governmental. And lastly, I will conclude by recapping everything that was presented and leaving the government of Guatemala with a clear path to development. Guatemala has endured dictators since the 20th century and experienced a gruesome and deadly civil war from 1960 to 1996. This 36 years long civil war resulted in either the deaths or disappearances of more than 200,000 people. It was not until 1985 that a democratic constitution was adopted, and in 1986 a democratically elected government was inaugurated. Guatemala is the most populated country in Central America and the biggest economy in the region and has had relatively stable economic growth. However, economic inequality and poverty have increased, especially among the rural indigenous population. On top of increased inequality and poverty, corruption is also widespread in Guatemala. Corruption runs rampant in Guatemala's judicial system, with bribes and irregular payments being used in exchange for favorable decisions, and the courts suffer from political interference. Judicial corruption contributes to the institution's inefficiency and delays in handling cases, often resulting in the injustice of many Guatemalan citizens. In the police force, there are high levels of corruption and impunity, with the government lacking adequate mechanism to investigate corruption. Guatemala has high crime rates, and citizens and businesses do not see the police as reliable in protecting them. In land administration, property rights are defined, but Guatemala's poor rule of law has made property rights useless in practice. This paves the way for abuses, fraud, and illegalities, often with the indigenous population. In the tax administration, companies bribe tax officials. In customs administration, there are high levels of corruption in customs transactions, especially in ports and borders outside the capital. In public procurement, bribes and irregular payments are exchanged in the procurement process, and companies believe that funds are often diverted to companies and individuals due to corruption. In civil society, freedoms of speech and press are protected by law, but there is an increase in violations of these freedoms, and this has raised concerns among international organizations. Libel and defamation are criminal offenses, and the government and authorities sometimes use this to silence the press, especially when the press is investigating government corruption. It is also very difficult for the public to obtain government information, even though the law provides public access. There is very little cooperation between civil society organizations and the government, resulting in several activists being victims of threats, attacks, and intimidations. There were 87 complaints of threats in 2016 and 8 killings. This is just a brief overview of some of the areas that need attention and that have created an atmosphere of hopelessness in Guatemala. With this atmosphere, it is easy to assess the current status of development in Guatemala as minimal and bleak. There are high levels of violence and insecurity. This stems from a prominent presence of narcotics in the country, lasting tensions from the Civil War, corruptions in the police force and the military, and the inefficiency of the police to protect citizens. There continues to be extreme inequality in Guatemala despite economic growth. There are high levels of poverty, with numbers reaching 59.3%, and 52% are indigenous peoples. And there remains low social development. People do not feel that they have freedom to have the best life possible. They are restrained by economic inequality or corruption in the government and are unable to rise out of poverty and receive the benefits of development. The poverty level in Guatemala has risen and has one of the highest inequality rates in Latin America, along with some of the worst poverty, malnutrition, and maternal to child mortality rates in the region. And this is especially true for rural and indigenous areas. Guatemala does have an opportunity to reduce poverty by supporting public investment as a tool to achieving Guatemala's development goals. Unfortunately, public investment is constrained by lack of resources, and the government collects the lowest share of public revenues in the world relative to the size of its economy. But again, the economy is only part of the picture when looking at development, and Guatemala has to focus on improving the levels of citizen security because high levels of crime and violence signify staggering economic cost for the country. Corruption is one of the biggest indicators that will be looked at in this presentation and the area that the government needs to pay the most attention to if they wish to become a developed country. Guatemala has continued to increase its corruption rank and currently rests at 143 out of 180 countries. Government integrity is also extremely low at 27.3%, falling under the category of repressed and well under the global average on government integrity at 42.1%. Corruption, unfortunately, is a common theme in many Latin American countries, and Guatemala is no different. The most recent example of government corruption came with the resignation of President and Vice President in 2015. Attorney General Adana and the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, or CICIG, exposed a customs fraud network at the National Tax Agency. This corruption case resulted in the arrest of dozens of people and implicated high-level government officials and private sector individuals as well. Since this case, many more high-level officials have been implicated in corruption cases, including 3 justices of the Supreme Court of Justice. Guatemalan police then arrested another former president in 2018, along with 9 former members of his cabinet for charges related to a $35 million fraud case involving a new bus system. Guatemala then elected Jimmy Morales, who took office in 2016. Unfortunately, Morales, who campaigned on an anti-corruption campaign, has not eased Guatemala of its tiring government corruption. Morales is being investigated for corruption and has survived 2 attempts to remove his immunity from prosecution. CICIG announced that they were seeking to lift Morales' immunity. And 2 days later, Morales declared the head of CICIG, Ivan Velázquez, persona non grata and ordered him to be expelled from the country. Fortunately, the Constitutional Court blocked this order. Morales' effort to expel the head of the CICIG has caused international worry and tension at the UN and between Guatemala and the US. The CICIG is crucial to improving the government's transparency and its relationship with the people of Guatemala. Continued corruption will only hinder Guatemala's effort to develop and become a country of prosperity. Not only is corruption an indicator of development, but so is inequality. There are two main groups of people in Guatemala that face the most inequality and discrimination, and this prevents the country as a whole from being recognized as a socially developed nation. The first is the indigenous population in Guatemala. Indigenous persons from 22 ethnic groups comprise 44% of the Guatemalan population. This is nearly half. Yet the same persons who make up this percentage, most of those also make up most of those living in poverty and are extremely underrepresented. There has been a lack of collaboration with indigenous representatives in a number of regional development projects, with many cases indigenous communities not being regularly consulted or able to participate in decisions concerning the exploitation of their resources in their communities. There is also a lack of effective mechanisms for communication between indigenous communities and the state to resolve conflicts. Indigenous communities continue to be underrepresented in national politics and remain outside the political, economic, social, and cultural mainstream. This exclusion can be attributed to limited educational opportunities, limited communication regarding their rights, and the lack of effective differentiation of indigenous lands, all contributing to disproportionate poverty among most indigenous populations. The other group of people who face severe inequality are women. Violence against women is not unique to Guatemala, but it is prominent across the country. Rape and domestic violence are illegal, but police have minimal training and capacity to investigate sexual crimes or to assist survivors of sexual crimes, and the government has not enforced the law regarding rape and domestic violence effectively. Femicide is a systematic murder of women and is rampant in Guatemala. The rate is third highest in Guatemala, only behind El Salvador and Jamaica, and 98% of femicide cases remain in impunity in Guatemala. It was reported in 2008 that more than 700 women were murdered in Guatemala, and that there are more than 500 femicides per year in Guatemala since 2001. And while the laws regarding femicide and sexual violence against women are getting stricter, the government lacks the capacity to assist victims, investigate cases, and ultimately lacks the mechanisms to enforce the laws. Also, there is still no single law that directly deals with sexual harassment, with many human rights organizations reporting that sexual harassment is widespread. There are ways to overcome these challenges to development. I propose that the government support the capabilities approach to government, along with ideas that stem from post-structuralism and postmodernism theory. The capabilities approach, also known as human development, differs from the traditional approach to development, which is usually economic focused. This approach supports my assessment that the economy is only a portion of development and therefore should not be made the main focus of development efforts. Every sector of development is interconnected. And here I quote Amartya Sen, scholar and author of Development as Freedom. Quote, economic unfreedom can breed social unfreedom, just as social or political unfreedom can also foster economic unfreedom. End quote. The idea behind this approach is quite simply freedom, or the removal of unfreedom. Development is less about economic growth and more about expanding the capabilities of people. And when these capabilities are expanded, they allow individuals to lead the kind of lives that they value or have reason to value. This approach is exactly what the government needs to pursue in order to achieve development. The path to development means that issues of corruption and inequality need to be dealt with before the economy can be expected to grow and remain stable. The economy will only continue to suffer as long as the poverty rate continues to soar. And the poverty rate will continue to soar as long as corruption goes unpunished and inequality and discrimination remain a part of social norms in Guatemala. This idea is where the capabilities approach and the post-structuralism and postmodernism theory coincide. This theory throws out the traditional model of the West versus the rest, or the West knows best. Foreign aid and development has been modeled after the development of the West, which, as history has shown, and developmentalists are starting to realize, this approach has been extremely detrimental to the development of countries. It has also been presumed that development meant modernization, but now it is being realized that development means freedom to choose the path to development and that local governments should be supported. This idea, taken from post-structuralism and postmodernism, that development should be localized, should also be supported by the Guatemalan government. This would be a step in the right direction of dealing with the inequality and discrimination that plagues the indigenous communities in Guatemala. Because Guatemala is a developing country and has many obstacles to overcome, the government will need partners who support these new approaches. U.S. aid was created by President Kennedy in 1961 to lead the U.S. government's international development and humanitarian efforts. This program has a twofold purpose of promoting America's interest while improving the lives in the developing world. There are flaws to partnering with U.S. aid. It was created at a time when modernization theory was the popular development theory, and it was heavily used to combat communism with the cover of providing humanitarian aid. It can get caught up in political red tape and focus on the needs of Washington rather than those it is supposed to be serving. There is a risk to partnering with U.S. aid, but I believe that the initiative that inspired U.S. aid forward still exists within the agency and can benefit the government of Guatemala. U.S. aid forward was created to harness and support local people and institutions overseas, and while it no longer exists, it shows that U.S. aid recognizes the shift in thinking about development and is willing to support localized efforts of development. Also, U.S. aid is committed to working with the government of Guatemala to strengthen security and justice for citizens and increase economic growth and social development. And while U.S. aid has a broad reach and pours money into many different sectors in Guatemala, it also has the capacity to facilitate work with smaller and more focused organizations. One of those organizations is Catholic Relief Services. Originally, CRS was focused on just humanitarian aid through food security, nutrition, health, agriculture, education, disaster, risk reduction, and emergency response programs for the poorest and most vulnerable. But now they also work through local partners to implement projects as part of their strategies to strengthen local capacity and skills and to promote sustainable solutions. One focus they have is institutional development, where they are committed to working with local partner institutions to develop organizational systems and governments and improve their capacity to access resources and influence systems and structures to achieve strategic goals. While CRS is a religious organization, they are also the top partner with Guatemala. CRS has the dedication and initiative to support local institutions and promote local governance. In conclusion, I have laid out the areas of concerns that the government should be paying attention to, rather than only worrying about economic growth. Those areas are extreme poverty rates, rampant corruption, and inequality and discrimination. In this age of achieving development, the traditional model of modernization is being replaced with new approaches. I recommend that the government pursue the capabilities approach, along with incorporating some ideas from post-structuralism and postmodernism, in order to address the areas of concern previously laid out. Guatemala will benefit from following perspectives that support freedoms and localized development, as opposed to the Western model of development. In order to achieve the desired development, Guatemala will need strong partners, and I have recommended two: one governmental agency and one non-governmental. Both have the capacity to assist Guatemala in overcoming its obstacles to development. The goal of development for the government of Guatemala is to see its people out of extreme poverty, to see corruption stopped and institutions rebuilt, and to see the inequality and violence end in the country. When a country has social and political prosperity, then economic prosperity will be soon to follow.